The mahogany doors of the federal courthouse opened with a whisper, but the silence that followed was deafening. I watched from the defendant's table as my brother Marcus adjusted his silk tie, that same arrogant smirk playing across his lips that I'd seen my entire life. His defense team, a battalion of expensive suits from the most prestigious law firm in San Diego, whispered reassurances in his ear. He looked utterly confident, completely untouchable, like this was just another minor inconvenience on his golden path to success. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The bailiff's voice cut through the tension like a blade. All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Hernandez. But then he paused, consulting his notes with unusual formality. Before we proceed, this court acknowledges the presence of the convening authority for these proceedings under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. I saw the first flicker of confusion cross Marcus's face. His lawyer leaned in, whispering something urgent. The heavy oak doors at the rear of the courtroom began to swing open again, and Marcus turned in his chair, curiosity replacing confidence for just a moment. Announcing Admiral Sarah Mitchell, Commander Naval Special Warfare Command. The world seemed to slow as I stepped through that doorway in my dress-white uniform, the gold braid gleaming under the harsh courtroom lights. The 4 stars on my collar caught the light like tiny supernovas, and every person in that room, including the judge, snapped to attention. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions I'll never forget: confusion, disbelief, recognition, and finally, pure terror. For the first time in 38 years, my older brother was looking up at me. The story of how I got to that courtroom began on a sweltering August evening in Corpus Christi, Texas, at what was supposed to be a celebration of Marcus's latest triumph. The entire Mitchell family had gathered at the country club, the kind of place where the silverware costs more than most people's monthly rent, to toast his promotion to senior partner at Henderson Blake & Associates, one of the most powerful maritime law firms on the Gulf Coast. I sat at the far end of the table, invisible as always, watching my parents lavish praise on their golden child. My father, William Mitchell, a man who'd spent his entire career climbing the ladder at an oil refinery, beamed with pride as Marcus regaled the table with stories of his latest victory, a case that had saved his corporate clients millions in environmental fines. My mother, Patricia, hung on his every word like he was delivering the Sermon on the Mount. I was 34 years old, and home on what I'd told them was a brief leave from my desk job at the Naval Air Station. Of course, that wasn't exactly the truth, but the truth was classified at levels they couldn't even imagine. To them, I was Sarah, the daughter who'd disappointed them by enlisting instead of going to college, who'd somehow managed to stick around the military for 16 years, doing whatever mundane paperwork keeps the Navy running. The conversation at dinner was predictable. Marcus dominated with stories of courtroom victories and 7-figure settlements. My parents contributed appropriate gasps of amazement and pride. I contributed nothing, because nothing was expected of me. I was furniture with a pulse. Then Marcus, emboldened by his 3rd scotch and the intoxicating drug of being the center of attention, decided to include me in his performance. "You know, Sarah here tried to make something of herself too," he announced to the table, his voice carrying that particular tone of condescending amusement I knew so well. "Joined the Navy right out of high school. We all thought she'd wash out of boot camp in the first week." The table chuckled politely. My mother shot me a look that was equal parts pity and embarrassment. "Well, she did stick with it longer than we expected," she added, as if my 16-year career was some kind of participation trophy. Marcus wasn't finished. He gestured toward me with his glass, the amber liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. "Now she's stationed right here in Texas, pushing papers and processing forms, living in some little apartment on base, collecting her government paycheck." He paused for effect, enjoying the spotlight. But hey, steady work, right? Not everyone can handle the pressure of real practice. The laughter that followed felt like acid in my veins. What made it worse was seeing the face of one of Marcus's dinner guests, a man I'd recognized the moment I walked in, but who clearly hadn't recognized me. Admiral Robert Hayes, the former chief of naval operations, now working as a maritime security consultant. He was one of Marcus's clients, but more importantly, he was scheduled to be briefed by me at the Pentagon the following Tuesday on Operation Deep Current, a classified anti-piracy initiative I'd been running in the South China Sea for the past 18 months. His expression was carefully neutral, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes. He knew exactly what Marcus's casual dismissal implied about the military he'd devoted his life to serving. Marcus saw him only as another impressed audience member, completely unaware that he'd just insulted a four-star admiral's entire professional world to the very man I was about to brief on matters of national security. The dinner continued, but something fundamental had shifted, not just in me, but in the trajectory of both our lives. Marcus had no idea he'd just lit the fuse on a bomb that had been 16 years in the making. To understand how that moment would eventually lead to Marcus sitting in a federal courtroom facing charges of treason, you have to understand the two completely different lives I'd been living since the day I enlisted. There was the life my family saw, and there was the life I'd actually been building in the shadows of their indifference. The family's version of my story was written in stone during my senior year of high school. I was 18, sitting in our cramped kitchen in Beaumont, surrounded by college brochures my parents had collected for Marcus, who was already a sophomore at UT Law School. The conversation I'd been dreading finally came to a head on a humid Thursday evening in March. "Sarah, honey," my mother began, using that particular tone that meant she was about to deliver unwelcome news gently. "Your father and I have been talking about your future." My father cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the small space. He was still wearing his refinery uniform, the name patch reading W. Mitchell, Supervisor, in bold letters. "We know you've been struggling with your grades, and college is expensive, real expensive." The unspoken comparison hung in the air like smoke. Marcus had graduated valedictorian. Marcus had gotten a full academic scholarship. Marcus was everything I apparently wasn't. My mother reached across the table and patted my hand with the kind of gentle condescension usually reserved for sick pets.
"We think maybe you should consider some practical options. Community college, maybe? Or there's always that technical school program for medical assistants. Something stable, something you can handle." Something I can handle. The words hit like a physical blow. I thought about the Naval Academy brochure hidden in my bedroom, the one I'd requested after watching a documentary about submarine warfare. I thought about the recruiter I'd been secretly talking to, who'd told me my test scores were among the highest he'd ever seen. "Actually," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I've been thinking about the Navy." The silence that followed was deafening. My father's fork clattered against his plate. My mother's face went through a series of expressions that settled on barely concealed horror. "The military?" my father finally managed. "Sarah, be reasonable. You're not built for that kind of thing. All that physical training, the discipline, the pressure, you'd never make it through basic training." My mother nodded vigorously. "And it's so dangerous, honey. All those wars and conflicts. You're better suited for something quieter, something safer." She gestured vaguely around our modest kitchen. "Something more appropriate for a girl like you." The conversation ended with me promising to think about their suggestions, but my mind was already made up. 3 months later, I was on a bus to Great Lakes Naval Training Center, carrying a single duffel bag and a determination forged in the fire of their low expectations. What they never knew, what they never bothered to ask about, was what happened after that bus ride. They saw the girl who left for boot camp, but they never really met the woman who came back. Over the next 16 years, while they were busy celebrating Marcus's courtroom victories and partnership tracks, I was building something extraordinary in the world they'd dismissed as inappropriate for someone like me. The real Sarah Mitchell wasn't the paper-pushing clerk they imagined. The real Sarah Mitchell had graduated first in her class from the Naval Academy after completing her enlisted service. The real Sarah Mitchell had been selected for the Navy SEALs support program, one of only 12 women ever chosen for the position. The real Sarah Mitchell had completed 3 combat deployments, earned a master's degree in international relations from Georgetown, and been personally recruited by naval intelligence for operations so classified that acknowledging their existence would be a federal crime. By the time I was 34, I wasn't processing paperwork at a desk in Corpus Christi. I was running covert operations across 3 continents, briefing 4-star admirals and cabinet-level officials, and commanding budgets that exceeded the GDP of small nations. The modest apartment on base that Marcus had mocked was actually a cover address. My real residence was a secure facility outside Washington, D.C., where I lived when I wasn't deployed to places that didn't officially exist on any map. The contrast between their perception and my reality came into sharp focus every time I came home. They'd ask about my little job while I was mentally shifting gears from running international counterterrorism operations to pretending I cared about local gossip and family drama. They'd offer me career advice while I was carrying security clearances they'd never heard of and couldn't pronounce. The irony was suffocating. My mother would worry about me being alone, not knowing I was part of an elite community of warriors who'd trust each other with their lives. My father would lecture me about the importance of steady employment while I was earning commendations from the highest levels of the defense establishment. Marcus would condescend to me about real-world pressure while I was making decisions that affected national security and international stability. But I let them believe their version of my story because it was easier than trying to bridge a gap they'd never understand. The security clearances I held meant I couldn't tell them what I really did. And even if I could have, they'd built their identities so firmly around Marcus being the successful one that any challenge to that narrative would have shattered their worldview. So I played the role they'd written for me. I was the quiet daughter who'd found steady work in the military, nothing special, nothing threatening to the family hierarchy they'd established. It was a performance I'd perfected over 16 years, and it might have continued indefinitely if not for Marcus's fatal combination of arrogance and greed. The first crack in our separate worlds appeared 6 months after that humiliating dinner at the country club. I was in my office at the Pentagon, a secure facility 3 levels below ground where natural light was a luxury and every surface was designed to prevent electronic surveillance. My official title was Deputy Director of Maritime Security Operations, but that was just the public face of what I actually did. I was reviewing intelligence reports from our assets in Southeast Asia when my aide, Commander Jennifer Walsh, knocked on my door with an expression that immediately put me on alert. Jennifer was former Navy intelligence herself, a woman who'd seen enough classified briefings to remain unflappable in most circumstances. The fact that she looked troubled meant something significant was happening. "Admiral, we've got a problem with Operation Deep Current," she said, closing the door behind her and activating the white noise generators that would prevent any electronic eavesdropping. The data breach analysis came back from the FBI's cyber division. She placed a thick folder on my desk, marked with classification stamps that would send anyone with appropriate clearance to federal prison just for looking at them. Inside were forensic reports, financial records, and surveillance photos that painted a picture I'd hoped never to see. Operation Deep Current was a joint Navy-CIA initiative designed to intercept maritime trafficking operations in international waters. The intelligence we gathered was used to coordinate with allied navies in disrupting everything from drug smuggling to human trafficking to the movement of weapons to terrorist organizations. The operation was so sensitive that less than 50 people in the entire government knew it existed. Someone had been selling our operational intelligence to the very criminal organizations we were trying to stop. Ships we'd been tracking would suddenly change course just hours before interdiction operations. Safe houses we'd identified would be abandoned minutes before raids.
It was a systematic compromise of our entire network, and it was getting people killed. The FBI's cyber forensics had traced the leak to a specific law firm in San Diego, Henderson, Blake & Associates. Someone with access to maritime shipping schedules and port security protocols had been selling information to a network of smugglers operating throughout the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. I stared at the name on the report, a cold realization washing over me like ice water. Henderson, Blake & Associates, Marcus's firm, the same firm that had been celebrating his promotion to senior partner 6 months earlier, the same firm that represented shipping companies, port authorities, and maritime security contractors throughout the region. Jennifer was watching my face carefully. "Ma'am, there's more. The financial analysis shows the payments were going directly to one of the partners, someone with high-level access to client files and shipping manifests." She slid another document across the desk. It was a bank routing record showing wire transfers totaling more than $2 million over the past 18 months. The account belonged to Marcus Mitchell. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. This wasn't just a security breach. This wasn't even just treason. This was personal betrayal on a scale I couldn't have imagined. While I was risking my life to protect American interests overseas, my own brother was selling secrets that were getting sailors and intelligence operatives killed. My first instinct was to call him, to demand an explanation, to give him a chance to justify what I was seeing. But 16 years of military training and intelligence work had taught me better than to act on emotion. Instead, I did what I'd been trained to do. I treated Marcus Mitchell like any other target in a counterintelligence operation. "Commander Walsh," I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest, "I need you to coordinate with FBI and Justice. This is now a federal case under the Espionage Act." "Yes, ma'am. What about jurisdiction, since it involves military operations?" "It falls under UCMJ. We'll handle the investigation, but I want Justice to handle prosecution. Full court-martial authority." I paused, the weight of what I was authorizing settling over me like a lead blanket. "And Jennifer, this investigation is compartmentalized, need to know only." She nodded and turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Ma'am, should I notify your family liaison about potential complications?" "No," I said quietly. "They don't need to know anything about this until it's over." After she left, I sat alone in my office, surrounded by the evidence that my brother had betrayed everything I'd sworn to protect. The family that had never understood my service, that had dismissed my career as a government job, had produced a traitor whose actions were undermining the very missions I was risking my life to complete. The investigation that followed was the most difficult professional challenge of my career. Every piece of evidence we uncovered felt like another personal betrayal, but I approached it with the same methodical precision I'd bring to any other case. We traced financial records, analyzed shipping manifests, and built a network map that showed exactly how Marcus had been monetizing classified information. He'd been brilliant about it, in his own sociopathic way. As a maritime lawyer representing shipping companies, he had legitimate access to port schedules and cargo manifests. But he'd been cross-referencing that information with intelligence he was somehow accessing about our interdiction operations. When we figured out how he was getting classified information, the betrayal became even more personal. Admiral Robert Hayes, the former chief of naval operations who'd been at that humiliating dinner 6 months earlier, had been feeding Marcus information in exchange for favorable legal representation for his consulting firm. The man who'd served his country for 35 years had been corrupted by my brother's promises of easy money and legal protection. The irony was staggering. Marcus had unknowingly insulted Hayes at dinner while simultaneously bribing him to commit treason. Hayes had been sitting there listening to Marcus dismiss his uniformed service while secretly selling out the very operations I was commanding. Building the case took 8 months of careful investigation, during which I had to continue playing my role as the forgettable little sister whenever I came home. The contrast between my day job hunting traitors and my family role as the disappointing daughter became almost surreal. Marcus would call to complain about work stress while I was analyzing evidence of his crimes. My parents would worry about my little government job while I was coordinating with federal prosecutors to build a treason case against their golden child. The final piece fell into place on a cold Tuesday morning in February. We'd been conducting surveillance on Marcus for weeks, watching his patterns, documenting his contacts, and building the kind of airtight case that would survive any legal challenge his expensive lawyers might mount. Commander Walsh knocked on my door with a smile that told me everything I needed to know before she said a word. "We got him, Admiral. Full audio recording of him negotiating payment for next month's shipping schedules. $2 million for information that would compromise Operation Deep Current's interdiction of the Colombian cartel's new trafficking route." I listened to the recording 3 times. My brother's voice, clear and unmistakable, discussing the sale of classified intelligence with the same casual tone he'd used to negotiate any other business deal. He laughed at one point, joking about how his military connections had access to information that was worth its weight in gold to the right buyers. Military connections.
He was talking about me, about the intelligence I'd sworn to protect, about the operations that kept his comfortable world safe from the chaos he was helping to create. The betrayal was complete. That afternoon, I walked into the office of Admiral Patricia Voles, the Judge Advocate General of the Navy, and the person who would ultimately authorize Marcus's court-martial. She reviewed the evidence file with the same cold professionalism that had made her one of the most feared prosecutors in military justice. "This is thorough work, Sarah," she said, using my first name in a way that told me she understood the personal cost of what I'd built. "But I have to ask, are you prepared for what comes next? Once we move forward with this, there's no going back. Your family will never be the same." I thought about that question for a long moment, weighing 16 years of dismissal and condescension against a lifetime of blood relations and shared history. I thought about the sailors who died because of Marcus's betrayal, about the intelligence operatives whose covers had been blown, about the national security implications of his greed. "Admiral," I said finally, "my family stopped being the same the day they decided I wasn't worth their respect. This is about justice, not family." She nodded slowly, then reached for her pen. "Then let's give it to them." The arrest happened on a Wednesday morning while Marcus was having breakfast at his favorite cafe in downtown San Diego. FBI agents approached his table with the kind of professional courtesy reserved for high-profile arrests, allowing him to finish his coffee before explaining that he was being charged with violating the Espionage Act, conspiracy to commit treason, and providing material support to criminal organizations. I was in Washington when I got the call, sitting in a classified briefing about enhanced maritime security protocols. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was planning operations to protect American shipping while my brother was being arrested for compromising those same operations. My parents called me that evening, their voices breaking with confusion and panic. "Sarah, you have to help us understand this," my mother pleaded. "They're saying Marcus is a traitor, that he was selling secrets. It doesn't make sense. He's a lawyer, not a spy." "I don't know anything about it, Mom," I lied, the words tasting like poison in my mouth. "I just process paperwork, remember? This is way above my pay grade." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of family crisis management and legal maneuvering. Marcus hired the best defense team money could buy, lawyers who specialized in high-profile federal cases and had a reputation for getting wealthy clients reduced sentences through plea bargains and technicalities. My parents mortgaged their house to help pay for his defense, convinced that this was all some terrible misunderstanding that would be resolved once the right lawyers got involved. They called me constantly, looking for support, for reassurance, for any sign that their perfect son would survive this nightmare. I gave them what comfort I could while secretly coordinating with the prosecution team to ensure that Marcus's expensive lawyers wouldn't find any loopholes in the case I'd built. Every family phone call was an exercise in compartmentalization, separating the sister who loved them from the admiral who was determined to see justice done. The preliminary hearings were held in federal court in San Diego, close enough to home that my parents could attend every session. They sat in the front row, my mother clutching a rosary, my father looking like he'd aged 10 years in 10 weeks. Marcus sat at the defendant's table in an expensive suit, maintaining the arrogant confidence that had defined his entire life. His lawyers argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the financial records were incomplete, that their client was being railroaded by an overzealous prosecution. They painted Marcus as a successful attorney who'd become the victim of a government witch hunt, collateral damage in a national security investigation gone wrong. The prosecution presented their case methodically, building the same network of evidence I'd spent 8 months constructing: financial records, surveillance footage, audio recordings, and witness testimony from intelligence operatives who'd seen their missions compromised by Marcus's betrayal. But the defense team was good, very good. They raised questions about chain of custody, about the legality of certain surveillance methods, about whether a civilian court had jurisdiction over matters involving classified military operations. For a terrifying few days, it looked like Marcus might actually walk away from this. That's when the prosecution played their final card. The case was being transferred from civilian federal court to a military tribunal under the Uniform Code of Military Justice.
Since Marcus's crimes had directly compromised active military operations and resulted in the deaths of service members, he would be tried by court-martial rather than civilian jury. Marcus's confidence finally cracked. Military courts don't have the same procedural protections as civilian courts. Military prosecutors don't have to worry about sympathetic juries or constitutional technicalities. Military justice is about discipline, order, and protecting the institution that keeps the country safe. More importantly, military courts are presided over by military officers who understand the true cost of treason in ways that civilian judges never could. These would be Marcus's peers in rank and responsibility, people who devoted their lives to the same service he'd betrayed for money. But the most significant change was the identity of the convening authority, the senior officer who would ultimately approve the court-martial and any sentence that resulted from it. That authority would be the senior military official whose operations had been most directly compromised by Marcus's treason. That authority would be me. The court-martial was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in March, almost exactly 1 year after Marcus's arrest. The courtroom at Naval Base San Diego was a place built for military justice, with flags representing every branch of service and an atmosphere of solemnness that reflected the seriousness of military law. My parents arrived early, dressed in their best clothes and looking completely out of place among the uniformed officers and Navy lawyers who filled the gallery. They'd been told that a high-ranking admiral would be presiding over the proceedings, but they had no idea who that admiral would be. Marcus sat at the defendant's table with his legal team, still projecting confidence, but with an edge of nervousness that hadn't been there during the civilian proceedings. Military courts were an unknown quantity to him, a world where his money and connections carried less weight than duty and honor. The judge, a stern Navy captain with 25 years of service, called the court to order with the kind of authority that made everyone in the room snap to attention automatically. The prosecution, led by a Navy commander who'd built her reputation on complex espionage cases, laid out their charges with methodical precision: violation of the Espionage Act, conspiracy to commit treason, providing material support to criminal organizations. Each charge carried the potential for decades in federal prison, and the evidence supporting each charge was overwhelming. Marcus's defense team tried the same arguments they'd used in civilian court, but they fell flat in a military setting. Military prosecutors understood operational security in ways that civilian prosecutors never could. Military judges understood the life and death implications of intelligence breaches that civilian judges might see as abstract legal concepts. As the proceedings continued, I waited in a secure conference room adjacent to the courtroom, reviewing the final details of the case and preparing for my role as convening authority.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Commander Walsh had briefed me on the expected timeline, and we anticipated that the judge would call for the convening authority to appear sometime after the prosecution rested their case. The knock on my door came sooner than expected. "Admiral," Commander Walsh said, "the judge is ready for you." I stood up and straightened my dress uniform, checking the ribbons that told the story of 16 years of service in places Marcus had never heard of. The 4 stars on my collar felt heavier than usual, weighted with the responsibility of what was about to happen. "Ma'am," Commander Walsh said quietly, "are you ready for this?" I thought about the question, about the little girl who'd been told she'd never make it through basic training, about the young officer who'd been dismissed as a paper pusher, about the admiral who'd built her career on protecting the nation from threats her family couldn't imagine. "Commander," I said, "I've been ready for this my entire life." The bailiff's voice echoed through the courtroom as I prepared to step through those mahogany doors. "All rise for the convening authority," announcing Admiral Sarah Mitchell, Commander, Naval Special Warfare Command. I took a deep breath and stepped into the light, ready to show my family who I really was and what their dismissal had cost them. The girl they'd said would never make it past basic training was about to deliver justice as a 4-star admiral, and the reckoning, 16 years in the making, was finally at hand. The silence that followed my entrance into that courtroom was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just quiet, it was the complete absence of sound that comes when an entire room full of people suddenly realizes their understanding of reality has been fundamentally wrong. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady and strong, as I moved with measured steps toward the designated chair reserved for the convening authority. Every eye in that room was locked on me, but none more intensely than Marcus's. His face had gone through several stages of shock, and I watched each one with the clinical detachment I'd learned to maintain during the most challenging operations of my career. First came confusion. Why was his failure of a sister wearing a military uniform at all, let alone one with Admiral stars? Then recognition began to dawn, and with it, the slow-motion collapse of everything he thought he knew about his family, his world, and his place in it. My parents were a study in contrasts. My father, who'd spent 2 years as a draftee in the 1970s and never stopped talking about respecting the chain of command, had lurched to his feet in an automatic response that bypassed his conscious mind entirely. His body snapped into something resembling attention, muscle memory from decades past taking over while his brain struggled to process what he was seeing. My mother sat frozen, her rosary clutched in white-knuckled hands, staring at me as if I were a ghost. I took my seat with the same deliberate precision I brought to every professional situation, acknowledging the judge with a respectful nod before settling into the chair that represented the full authority of the United States Navy. The weight of command had never felt more significant than it did in that moment, surrounded by people who'd spent 16 years underestimating everything I was capable of achieving. The judge, Captain Rebecca Torres, was a woman I'd worked with on several classified cases involving military justice and national security. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught the slight hint of respect in her eyes as she acknowledged my presence. The court recognizes Admiral Mitchell as the convening authority for these proceedings. Admiral, do you wish to address the court before we continue? I stood again, my voice carrying the authority that comes from years of commanding respect in the most dangerous situations imaginable. Your Honor, the charges against the defendant represent a direct threat to ongoing naval operations and the safety of personnel under my command. The Navy requests that this court proceed with full military justice protocols. My words weren't just legal formality, they were a declaration of war against the betrayal that had cost lives and compromised national security. But they were also something more personal, a statement that the little sister who'd been dismissed and patronized her entire life was no longer asking for respect, I was commanding it. As I sat back down, I allowed myself to look directly at Marcus for the first time since entering the room. The transformation in his appearance was startling. The arrogant confidence that had defined him his entire life had evaporated, replaced by a pale, hollow-eyed terror that made him look like a stranger. He whispered something urgent to his lead attorney, a man whose reputation for defending high-profile federal cases had cost my parents their retirement savings. The attorney, Thomas Brennan, was clearly struggling to adapt to this new reality. His entire defense strategy had been built around the assumption that this was a civilian case involving technical violations of maritime law. The sudden shift to military tribunal had already thrown his team off balance, but my presence as the convening authority had shattered their confidence completely. Brennan rose to address the court, his voice carrying none of the smooth assurance I'd expected from someone with his reputation. Your Honor, the defense requests a brief recess to consult with our client regarding these new developments. Captain Torres's response was crisp and uncompromising. Request denied, Counselor. Your client has had months to prepare for these proceedings. The court will proceed. The prosecution, led by Commander Lisa Chen, stood to present their opening statement. I'd worked with Chen on several cases involving intelligence breaches, and I knew her reputation for methodical, devastating presentations that left no room for doubt. She moved to the center of the courtroom with the confident bearing of someone who'd built an unshakable case. Your Honor, members of the court, the evidence will show that Marcus Mitchell engaged in a systematic pattern of espionage that directly endangered the lives of United States military personnel and compromised ongoing operations critical to national security. Her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. The defendant used his position as a maritime attorney to access classified shipping schedules and port security protocols, which he then sold to criminal organizations for personal profit totaling over $2 million. She moved to a large display screen and activated a presentation that I'd helped develop during the investigation.
Financial records, shipping manifests, and surveillance photos filled the screen in precise sequence, telling the story of Marcus's betrayal with documentary evidence that would be impossible to dispute. The defendant's crimes resulted in the compromise of Operation Deep Current, a classified naval interdiction program designed to combat maritime trafficking and terrorism. 3 separate missions were compromised due to intelligence sold by the defendant, resulting in the deaths of 2 Navy SEALs and an intelligence operative who remains missing and presumed dead. The last statement hit the courtroom like a physical blow. This wasn't just about money or national security in the abstract. It was about blood, about the ultimate price paid by service members whose missions had been betrayed by Marcus's greed. I watched my parents' faces as the reality of what their golden child had done began to sink in. Commander Chen continued her presentation with relentless precision, building the case piece by piece with the kind of thorough preparation that leaves no room for reasonable doubt. She showed the court how Marcus had used his legitimate access to port authorities and shipping companies to identify valuable intelligence about Navy operations. She demonstrated how he'd cultivated Admiral Hayes as a source of classified information, trading legal favors for access to operational details that should never have left secure facilities. The audio recordings were perhaps the most damning evidence. Marcus's voice, clear and unmistakable, discussing the sale of intelligence with casual indifference to the consequences. In one particularly devastating recording, he joked about how his military connection, meaning me, had access to information that was worth millions to the right buyers. Hearing my brother laugh about exploiting our family relationship to commit treason was a moment I'll never forget. The betrayal was complete, not just of his country and his oath as an American citizen, but of every bond that should have made such betrayal unthinkable.
He'd used me, used the dismissive way our family had always treated my service as cover for crimes that had gotten people killed. The prosecution's presentation continued for 3 hours, each piece of evidence building on the last to create an overwhelming picture of guilt. Bank records showing the progression of payments from Marcus's criminal contacts, shipping manifests that had been altered based on intelligence he'd provided, surveillance footage of him meeting with known trafficking coordinators in anonymous locations throughout San Diego and Los Angeles. By the time Commander Chen concluded her opening statement, the case against Marcus was so comprehensive that his defense team looked like they were preparing for surrender rather than a legal battle. Brennan's face had gone ashen as he realized the magnitude of evidence arrayed against his client, and the other defense attorneys were frantically taking notes as they tried to identify any possible avenue for challenging what they'd heard. But the most telling reaction was Marcus himself. The man who'd spent his entire life believing that his intelligence and charm could get him out of any situation was finally confronting evidence that couldn't be manipulated, explained away, or dismissed with condescending laughter. He sat at the defendant's table like a man watching his own execution, which in many ways he was. Captain Torres called for a brief recess before the defense would present their opening statement, and the courtroom slowly emptied as spectators and legal teams moved to the corridors to discuss what they'd witnessed. I remained in my chair, both because protocol required it and because I wasn't ready to face the inevitable confrontation with my parents. They approached my position with the hesitant steps of people walking through a minefield, my mother's face streaked with tears, and my father looking like he'd aged a decade in the past 4 hours. When they reached the barrier that separated the gallery from the official proceedings area, my mother whispered my name like a prayer. "Sarah, Sarah, is this really you?" I looked at them for a long moment, these people who'd shaped my entire early life, and then spent 16 years dismissing everything I'd accomplished since leaving their narrow world. The little girl in me wanted to forgive them, to explain everything, to somehow bridge the gap that had always existed between us. But the Admiral in me, the woman who'd earned these stars through blood and sacrifice they couldn't imagine, remained silent. My father cleared his throat, that same sound that had preceded so many lectures about being realistic and finding something I could handle. But this time, his voice carried a note of confusion and something that might have been awe. "We had no idea. All these years, we thought you were just... We didn't know." "No," I said quietly, my voice carrying just enough volume for them to hear. "You never bothered to ask."
The hurt in my mother's eyes was genuine, but it was 16 years too late. They'd made their choice about who I was and what I was worth when I was 18 years old, and nothing I'd accomplished since then had been enough to change their minds. It had taken this moment, this public revelation of their fundamental misjudgment, to make them question the narrative they'd constructed about their disappointing daughter. Before the conversation could continue, Captain Torres called the court back to session. My parents returned to their seats in the gallery, moving like people who'd just learned that everything they thought they knew about the world was wrong. I took my position as convening authority, preparing to watch the defense attempt to salvage something from a case that was already lost. Thomas Brennan rose to present his opening statement with the demeanor of a man who knew he was fighting an uphill battle against overwhelming odds. His strategy, as it quickly became apparent, was to humanize Marcus and minimize the scope of his crimes rather than deny them outright. Your Honor, members of the court, my client stands before you as a man who made serious errors in judgment, but not as a traitor to his country. Brennan's voice carried practiced sincerity, but it rang hollow in a courtroom filled with military officers who understood the true weight of the oath every American swears to defend the Constitution. Marcus Mitchell is a successful attorney who became involved with individuals he should have avoided, who made financial decisions he should have reconsidered, but who never intended to harm his country or endanger military personnel. The argument was technically sophisticated but fundamentally dishonest, and every officer in that courtroom knew it. Brennan continued with his attempt to reframe Marcus's systematic betrayal as a series of unfortunate coincidences and poor choices. He argued that Marcus had been manipulated by more sophisticated criminals, that he'd been unaware of the full implications of the information he was providing, that his actions were motivated by financial pressure rather than anti-American sentiment. It was a defense built on willful ignorance and selective memory, designed to convince a jury that might be sympathetic to the idea that a successful professional could simply stumble into treason without understanding what he was doing. But this wasn't a civilian jury of Marcus's peers. This was a military court filled with officers who devoted their lives to protecting the same secrets Marcus had sold for profit. The defense presentation lasted barely an hour, a stark contrast to the prosecution's comprehensive case. Brennan had clearly hoped to create reasonable doubt about Marcus's intent and the scope of his knowledge, but the evidence was too overwhelming to support anything more than token resistance. When the opening statements concluded, Captain Torres announced that the court would hear testimony beginning the following morning. As the courtroom began to empty, I remained in my chair, watching Marcus being led away by military police. He looked back at me once, and for a moment, I saw not the arrogant, condescending older brother who dominated my childhood, but a broken man finally understanding the consequences of choices he thought he was too smart to be caught making. That evening, I returned to my quarters at Naval Base San Diego, a secure facility that was worlds away from the modest apartment my family imagined I lived in. My actual residence was a testament to the rank and responsibility I'd earned, a spacious suite with secure communication equipment, classified briefing materials, and the kind of security protocols that reflected my access to the nation's most sensitive secrets. Commander Walsh was waiting for me with updates on several ongoing operations that couldn't be delayed just because I was presiding over my brother's court-martial. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my family was grappling with the revelation of who I really was, I still had responsibilities that spanned the globe and affected the safety of thousands of personnel under my command. Admiral, we've received confirmation from the Pacific Fleet that Operation Deep Current has been successfully reconfigured with new protocols, she reported. The compromised routes have been replaced, and we're already seeing improved interdiction rates. The success of the reconfigured operation was a reminder of why Marcus's betrayal had been so devastating. The intelligence he'd sold hadn't just compromised abstract national security interests, it had directly endangered the lives of sailors and special operations personnel who depended on operational security for their survival. What about the missing operative? I asked, referring to the intelligence agent who'd been captured during one of the compromised missions. Still no contact, ma'am. The agency is exploring diplomatic channels, but given the sensitivity of the operation, she didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew that the missing operative was likely dead, another casualty of Marcus's greed. That night, I couldn't sleep.
I stood at the window of my quarters, looking out at the lights of San Diego Harbor, thinking about the parallel lives I'd been living for 16 years. Tomorrow, the prosecution would begin presenting their case in detail, and my family would be forced to confront the full scope of what they'd missed about my life and career. But tonight, I found myself thinking about the cost of the secrets I'd kept. The security clearances that had prevented me from sharing my achievements with my family had also protected me from their judgment and dismissal.
I'd built an extraordinary career in the shadows of their indifference, but those shadows had also meant that I'd been alone in a way that most people never experience. The respect I commanded in my professional life was absolute and unquestioned. Officers who outranked my father in every meaningful way sought my counsel and deferred to my expertise. World leaders took my calls and implemented policies based on my recommendations. But none of that had translated into the basic recognition and respect that should have come from the people who'd known me longest. The trial continued the next morning, with the prosecution calling their first witness, Admiral Robert Hayes, the former chief of naval operations who'd been Marcus's source of classified information. Hayes had agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence, but his appearance in that courtroom was still one of the most dramatic moments of the proceedings. Watching a disgraced four-star admiral take the witness stand to testify about his own treason was surreal. Hayes had been a legend in the Navy, a man whose career had spanned some of the most significant military operations of the past 3 decades. To see him brought down by Marcus's corruption was a reminder of how thoroughly my brother's crimes had poisoned everything they touched. Commander Chen led Hayes through his testimony with the same methodical precision she'd brought to her opening statement. Step by step, she had him describe how Marcus had approached him, how the relationship had evolved from legitimate legal representation to criminal conspiracy, and how he'd provided classified information in exchange for favorable legal treatment. The most damaging part of Hayes's testimony was his description of how Marcus had used family connections to gain access to information about my operations. Hayes testified that Marcus had claimed to have a sister in military intelligence who could provide additional operational details if needed. The defendant told me that his sister was involved in naval operations, but that the family didn't take her work seriously, Hayes testified, his voice barely above a whisper. He said she was just a paper pusher who wouldn't understand the value of the information she had access to. Hearing those words spoken in open court was like being struck by lightning. Marcus hadn't just betrayed his country, he'd used our family's dismissive attitude toward my career as part of his criminal recruitment strategy. He'd told a potential co-conspirator that I was too insignificant and unaware to notice if classified information was being extracted from sources connected to my operations. The irony was devastating. Marcus had been so convinced of his family's narrative about my worthless military career that he'd never suspected I might be the very person investigating the intelligence leaks he was facilitating. He'd been selling secrets to criminals while dismissing the woman who was hunting him, never realizing that his condescending attitude toward my service was the very thing that had kept him from recognizing the danger he was in. Hayes's testimony continued for most of the morning, each revelation more damaging than the last. He described specific operations that had been compromised, naming sailors and intelligence operatives who died because of information he'd provided to Marcus. By the time Commander Chen finished her examination, Hayes looked like a man who'd been forced to watch a replay of his own moral collapse in excruciating detail. The defense's cross-examination of Hayes was brief and ineffective. Brennan tried to suggest that Hayes had been the primary criminal and that Marcus had been manipulated into participating, but the financial records and audio recordings made it clear that Marcus had been an eager and active participant in the conspiracy. The next witness was FBI Special Agent Maria Santos, the lead investigator on the cyber forensics team that had traced the intelligence leaks to their source. Her testimony was technical but devastating, walking the court through the digital evidence that connected Marcus's law firm to the criminal organizations that had been purchasing classified information. Agent Santos demonstrated how Marcus had used his firm's legitimate access to maritime databases to identify shipping schedules and cargo manifests that matched classified naval operations. She showed the court how he'd cross-referenced this information with intelligence provided by Admiral Hayes to create comprehensive intelligence packages that were sold to traffickers and terrorist organizations. The technical aspects of her testimony were complex, but the implications were crystal clear. Marcus hadn't stumbled into treason. He'd systematically exploited his professional position and family connections to build a sophisticated intelligence selling operation that had operated for over 18 months before being detected. During the lunch recess, my parents approached me again, but this time their demeanor was different. The shock and confusion had been replaced by something harder to define, a mixture of awe, regret, and what might have been fear. "Sarah," my father began, using the same tone he'd once used to lecture me about being realistic about my limitations. "We need to understand what's happening here. All these years, we thought you were working a desk job, processing forms. But this is something else entirely." I looked at him for a long moment. This man who'd spent my entire childhood explaining why I should aim lower, expect less, and settle for something I could handle. "Yes, Dad, this is something else entirely." My mother reached out as if to touch my arm, then seemed to think better of it. "Why didn't you tell us? All this time, we could have been proud of you. We could have supported you properly." The question hung in the air between us, laden with 16 years of missed opportunities and fundamental misunderstandings. Why hadn't I told them? The simple answer was that I couldn't. Security clearances and operational requirements had made it impossible to share the details of my career with anyone outside the intelligence community. But the deeper answer was more complicated and more painful. I hadn't told them because they'd made it clear from the beginning that they weren't interested in understanding who I was or what I was capable of achieving. They'd written my story when I was 18 years old, and nothing I'd accomplished since then had been enough to make them question their assumptions. "I tried to tell you," I said quietly. "When I graduated from the Naval Academy, when I was selected for special operations, when I earned my master's degree, when I was promoted to flag rank. Every time I came home, I tried to share what I was doing, and every time you changed the subject to talk about Marcus's latest success." The truth of that statement settled over them like a weight. I could see them mentally reviewing decades of conversations, remembering all the times they'd dismissed my attempts to share my achievements as unimportant compared to Marcus's courtroom victories and partnership advancement. "We didn't know," my mother whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We didn't," I agreed. "You didn't. But you never asked either." The afternoon session brought more technical testimony about the scope and impact of Marcus's betrayal. Financial experts explained how the $2 million in payments had been structured to avoid detection. Intelligence analysts described how the compromised operations had been reconfigured to prevent further damage. Military witnesses testified about the impact on personnel and operations. Each piece of testimony built on the last to create an overwhelming picture of systematic treason motivated by pure greed. There was no ideological justification, no political motivation, no mitigating circumstance that could explain or excuse what Marcus had done. The next witness was FBI Special Agent Maria Santos, the lead investigator on the cyber forensics team that had traced the intelligence leaks to their source. Her testimony was technical but devastating, walking the court through the digital evidence that connected Marcus's law firm to the criminal organizations that had been purchasing classified information. Agent Santos demonstrated how Marcus had used his firm's legitimate access to maritime databases to identify shipping schedules and cargo manifests that matched classified naval operations. She showed the court how he'd cross-referenced this information with intelligence provided by Admiral Hayes to create comprehensive intelligence packages that were sold to traffickers and terrorist organizations. The technical aspects of her testimony were complex, but the implications were crystal clear. Marcus hadn't stumbled into treason. He had systematically exploited his professional position and family connections to build a sophisticated intelligence selling operation that had operated for over 18 months before being detected. During the lunch recess, my parents approached me again, but this time their demeanor was different. The shock and confusion had been replaced by something harder to define, a mixture of awe, regret, and what might have been fear. "Sarah," my father began, using the same tone he'd once used to lecture me about being realistic about my limitations, "we need to understand what's happening here.
All these years, we thought you were working a desk job, processing forms. But this is something else entirely." I looked at him for a long moment. This man, who'd spent my entire childhood explaining why I should aim lower, expect less, and settle for something I could handle. "Yes, Dad, this is something else entirely." My mother reached out as if to touch my arm, then seemed to think better of it. "Why didn't you tell us? All this time, we could have been proud of you. We could have supported you properly." The question hung in the air between us, laden with 16 years of missed opportunities and fundamental misunderstandings. Why hadn't I told them? The simple answer was that I couldn't. Security clearances and operational requirements had made it impossible to share the details of my career with anyone outside the intelligence community. But the deeper answer was more complicated and more painful. I hadn't told them because they'd made it clear from the beginning that they weren't interested in understanding who I was or what I was capable of achieving. They'd written my story when I was 18 years old, and nothing I'd accomplished since then had been enough to make them question their assumptions. "I tried to tell you," I said quietly. "When I graduated from the Naval Academy, when I was selected for special operations, when I earned my master's degree, when I was promoted to flag rank. Every time I came home, I tried to share what I was doing, and every time you changed the subject to talk about Marcus's latest success." The truth of that statement settled over them like a wave.
He'd sold out his country for money, and people had died because of it. But perhaps the most devastating testimony came from Lieutenant Commander Jessica Torres, a Navy SEAL who'd been part of one of the compromised operations. She described in clinical detail how her team had walked into an ambush because their mission had been betrayed by intelligence Marcus had sold to the very criminals they were trying to apprehend. "We lost 2 teammates that night," she testified, her voice steady but her eyes blazing with controlled fury. Petty Officer 2nd Class Michael Chen and Petty Officer 1st Class David Rodriguez. They died because someone decided that classified information was worth more than their lives. The names of the dead hung in the courtroom air like an accusation. These weren't abstract casualties of war. They were specific individuals whose deaths could be directly traced to Marcus's betrayal. They had families, friends, careers, and futures that had been cut short because my brother had decided that $2 million was worth more than their lives. I watched Marcus during this testimony, searching for any sign of remorse or recognition of what his actions had cost. But his face remained a mask of self-pity and denial, more concerned with his own predicament than with the consequences of his choices. The prosecution's case continued for 3 days, each witness adding another layer to the comprehensive picture of guilt. By the time Commander Chen announced that the prosecution rested, the evidence against Marcus was so overwhelming that even his expensive defense team seemed to have given up any hope of acquittal. The defense case was brief and unconvincing. Brennan called character witnesses who testified to Marcus's reputation as a successful attorney and devoted family man, but their testimony rang hollow in the face of the evidence of his systematic betrayal. He presented expert witnesses who questioned some of the technical aspects of the intelligence analysis, but their testimony was easily dismantled by the prosecution's rebuttal. The most surreal moment came when Brennan called my parents as character witnesses for Marcus. I watched from my position as convening authority as they took the stand to testify about what a good son and brother Marcus had always been, how he'd supported the family, how his success had been a source of pride for everyone who knew him. Their testimony was heartfelt and genuine, but it was also completely irrelevant to the charges against him. Worse, it served as an inadvertent reminder of how they'd always valued Marcus's success over everything else, including the achievements of their other child, who was sitting in judgment of his crimes. During cross-examination, Commander Chen gently but firmly established that my parents had no knowledge of Marcus's criminal activities and no understanding of the military implications of his actions. She also elicited testimony about their treatment of my military career, creating a record that showed how the family dynamics had enabled Marcus's belief that he could exploit military connections without consequences. "Mrs. Mitchell," Commander Chen asked, "did you and your husband ever ask your daughter Sarah about the specific nature of her military duties?" My mother looked confused by the question. "Well, we knew she worked for the Navy, but it seemed like paperwork, administrative duties,
Nothing that would be classified or sensitive. Did you ask her directly about her responsibilities or achievements? We assumed she would tell us if it was important. The exchange was devastating in its simplicity. My parents had spent 16 years assuming that anything important happening in my life would somehow force its way into their consciousness, never considering that their dismissive attitude might have prevented me from sharing achievements they would have found impressive. The defense case concluded after 2 days of ineffective attempts to humanize Marcus and minimize his crimes. When Brennan announced that the defense rested, the courtroom felt like a place where justice was inevitable rather than hoped for. The closing arguments were scheduled for the following morning, and I spent that evening in my quarters reviewing the evidence one final time. As convening authority, I would ultimately approve whatever sentence the court imposed, and I wanted to be certain that justice would be both thorough and appropriate. Commander Walsh joined me for a final briefing on the impact of Marcus's crimes. The intelligence damage assessment was complete, and the numbers were staggering. Beyond the immediate casualties, his betrayal had compromised operations affecting dozens of countries and thousands of military personnel. The cost of reconfiguring compromised operations and replacing burned intelligence assets was estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But the human cost was immeasurable. The missing intelligence operative was still unaccounted for, presumed captured or killed. The families of the dead sailors were still grieving losses that could have been prevented. The trust between agencies and international partners had been damaged in ways that would take years to repair. "Admiral," Commander Walsh said as she prepared to leave, "I have to ask, was this worth it? Pursuing your own brother, I mean. The personal cost must be enormous." I considered her question for a long moment, thinking about the family relationships that had been destroyed, the illusions that had been shattered, the bridges that could never be rebuilt. Then I thought about Petty Officer Chen and Petty Officer Rodriguez, about their families, about the oath I'd sworn to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. "Commander," I said finally, "justice isn't about personal cost. It's about duty, and my duty has never been clearer." The next morning, the courtroom was packed for closing arguments. News of the trial had leaked to the media, and the public gallery was filled with reporters, military personnel, and family members of the victims. The weight of attention made the proceedings feel even more significant, a public reckoning with the cost of betrayal and the price of justice. Commander Chen's closing argument was masterful, weaving together all the evidence into a compelling narrative of systematic treason motivated by greed and enabled by arrogance. She reminded the court that Marcus had not only betrayed his country, but had used his family connections to facilitate that betrayal, exploiting the very bonds that should have made such crimes unthinkable. "The defendant sits before you as a man who sold the lives of American servicemen for personal profit," she concluded. "He used his professional position, his family connections, and his privileged access to information to build a criminal enterprise that directly resulted in the deaths of our sailors and the compromise of our national security. Justice demands accountability, and accountability demands consequences that match the scope of his crimes." Brennan's closing argument was a final, desperate attempt to salvage something from a hopeless case. He pleaded with the court to consider Marcus's lack of previous criminal history, his contributions to the community, his role as a family provider. But his words felt hollow in the face of the evidence, and even he seemed to know that he was simply going through the motions. The court recessed for deliberation, and I waited in my secure conference room for the verdict that everyone knew was inevitable. The only question was the severity of the sentence that would follow. Under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the charges Marcus faced could result in life imprisonment or even death, though the prosecution had not requested capital punishment. The deliberation lasted less than 2 hours. When the court reconvened, the air was thick with anticipation and a sense of impending finality.
The senior member of the panel, a Navy captain with 30 years of service, stood to deliver the verdict with the same precision he would bring to any military duty. "On the charge of violating the Espionage Act, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit treason, we find the defendant guilty. On all specifications of providing material support to criminal organizations, we find the defendant guilty." The words echoed through the courtroom like hammer blows, each one driving home the completeness of Marcus's fall from grace. He sat motionless at the defendant's table, finally confronting the reality that his intelligence and charm couldn't protect him from the consequences of his choices. The sentencing phase would follow immediately, and I knew that within hours I would be called upon to approve whatever punishment the court deemed appropriate. The little sister who'd been told she'd never amount to anything was about to determine the fate of the golden child who'd betrayed everything she'd sworn to protect. As the court prepared to hear arguments on sentencing, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. 16 years of parallel lives, of secret achievements and public dismissals, of building a career in the shadows while my family celebrated someone who was systematically destroying everything I'd worked to protect. The reckoning was almost complete, but the hardest part was still to come. Soon, I would have to decide not just whether justice had been served, but what price my brother would pay for choosing money over loyalty, greed over honor, and personal gain over the lives of the sailors who died because of his betrayal. The sentencing phase began immediately after the guilty verdict, and the courtroom atmosphere shifted from the clinical examination of evidence to something more raw and immediate. This was where the human cost of Marcus's betrayal would be translated into years behind bars, where abstract concepts of justice would become concrete consequences that would define the rest of his life. Commander Chen stood to present the prosecution's sentencing recommendation, her bearing reflecting the gravity of what she was about to request. Your Honor, the government recommends a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The defendant's crimes represent one of the most serious breaches of national security in recent military history, directly resulting in the deaths of American servicemen and the compromise of ongoing operations critical to our national defense. She moved to the center of the courtroom, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. The evidence has shown that this was not a moment of weakness or a single poor decision. This was a systematic, calculated betrayal that continued for over 18 months. The defendant used his professional position, his family connections, and his privileged access to information to build a criminal enterprise that treated classified intelligence as a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. The prosecution's argument continued with devastating precision. Chen outlined the scope of the damage Marcus had caused, the operational costs of repairing compromised missions, and the ongoing security implications of his betrayal. But most importantly, she focused on the human cost. The sailors who had died, the intelligence operative who remained missing, the families who would never recover from losses that could have been prevented. The defendant showed no remorse throughout these proceedings, she concluded. He has not acknowledged responsibility for his actions or expressed regret for the consequences of his choices. Justice demands a sentence that reflects the magnitude of his crimes and ensures that he can never again pose a threat to our national security. When Chen finished, the courtroom was silent except for the soft sound of my mother's crying. I watched my parents from my position as convening authority, seeing them finally confront the reality of what their golden child had become. The son they'd been so proud of, whose success had validated their choices and justified their priorities, was facing the prospect of dying in federal prison. Thomas Brennan rose to present the defense's plea for mitigation, but his arguments felt hollow after the overwhelming evidence of Marcus's guilt. He spoke about Marcus's contributions to the community, his lack of previous criminal history, his role as a provider for his family. He argued that life imprisonment was excessive for someone who had been motivated by financial pressure rather than ideological opposition to the United States. My client made serious errors in judgment, Brennan argued, his voice lacking the confidence he'd shown during the earlier phases of the trial. But he is not a terrorist or a foreign agent, he is an American citizen who became involved with criminal elements and made choices he now deeply regrets. The argument about regret was particularly galling, given that Marcus had shown no sign of remorse throughout the proceedings. He'd maintained his innocence even in the face of overwhelming evidence, more concerned with protecting his reputation than acknowledging the lives his actions had cost. Brennan continued with his plea for mercy, asking the court to consider a sentence that would allow Marcus to eventually return to his family and make amends for his mistakes.
But his words carried no conviction, and even he seemed to recognize that he was simply fulfilling his professional obligation to advocate for his client rather than presenting a genuinely compelling case for leniency. The court then heard victim impact statements from family members of the sailors who had died because of Marcus's betrayal. These were the most emotionally devastating moments of the entire trial, as parents, spouses, and children spoke about the cost of losing loved ones whose deaths could have been prevented. Maria Chen, the widow of Petty Officer Michael Chen, took the stand with a dignity that made her words even more powerful. "My husband died believing he was serving his country and protecting his fellow sailors," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "He never knew that his mission had been betrayed by someone who valued money more than the lives of the men and women he was sworn to protect." She spoke about their 2 young children, about the college funds that would now go unused, about the future that had been stolen from their family by Marcus's greed. Her testimony was a reminder that the consequences of his betrayal extended far beyond national security abstractions to include real families dealing with permanent, irreversible loss. David Rodriguez Sr., the father of Petty Officer David Rodriguez, followed with testimony that was even more devastating. His son had been planning to propose to his girlfriend when he returned from the mission that Marcus's betrayal had turned into a death trap. The engagement ring was still in his personal effects, a symbol of a future that would never come to pass. "The man who sold the information that killed my son will go home to his family every day for the rest of his life. My son will never come home. That's the difference between them, and that's why justice demands the harshest possible sentence." The victim impact statements continued for over an hour, each one adding another layer to the human cost of Marcus's crimes. By the time they concluded, even Marcus's expensive defense team looked shaken by the magnitude of suffering their client had caused. The court recessed for the panel to deliberate on sentencing, and I returned to my secure conference room to await their decision. As convening authority, I would have the final word on whatever sentence they recommended, but I knew that anything less than life imprisonment would be inadequate given the scope of Marcus's betrayal. Commander Walsh joined me during the recess with updates on several ongoing operations that required my attention. The irony wasn't lost on me that while my family was grappling with the destruction of everything they thought they knew about themselves, I still had responsibilities that affected the safety and security of personnel around the world. "Admiral, there's been a development in the search for the missing operative," she reported. "Intelligence sources suggest he may still be alive, but in the custody of the same organization that was purchasing information from your brother." The news hit me like a physical blow. The missing operative, Lieutenant Commander James Park, wasn't just a casualty of Marcus's betrayal. He was still suffering because of it, still paying the price for my brother's greed every day he remained in enemy hands. "What are the prospects for recovery?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would be grim. "Difficult at best, ma'am. The organization holding him has moved him several times since his capture, and they're using his continued captivity as leverage in ongoing negotiations with other criminal networks. The information he possessed has made him extremely valuable to them." I thought about Lieutenant Commander Park, about his family, about the daily nightmare they were living because Marcus had decided that classified information was a commodity to be sold. The missing operative wasn't just a statistic in an intelligence damage assessment, he was a real person whose suffering continued because of my brother's betrayal. The deliberation on sentencing took 3 hours, longer than the guilty verdict, but still relatively brief for such a serious case. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation and a sense of impending finality. The senior panel member stood to deliver the sentencing recommendation with the same military precision that had characterized the entire proceeding. After careful consideration of all evidence presented and the victim impact statements, this court sentences the defendant to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole to be served in a federal maximum security facility. The words echoed through the courtroom like a gavel striking wood. Marcus's face went completely white, and for the first time during the entire trial, his composure cracked completely. He turned to look at my parents, then at me, his expression a mixture of desperation and disbelief. My mother's sob was audible throughout the courtroom, a sound of pure anguish that cut through the formal atmosphere like a knife. My father sat motionless, staring at the floor, looking like a man who just watched his entire understanding of reality collapse. Captain Torres addressed me directly. "Admiral Mitchell, as convening authority, do you approve this sentence?" I stood slowly, feeling the weight of 16 years of family history and military duty pressing down on my shoulders. This was the moment I'd been building toward since the day I'd first seen Marcus's name on the target list for Operation Gilded Cage. This was where the parallel lives I'd been living would finally converge into a single moment of absolute judgment. I thought about the 18-year-old girl who'd been told she'd never make it through basic training. I thought about the young officer who'd been dismissed as a paper pusher. I thought about the Admiral who dedicated her life to protecting the nation from threats her family couldn't imagine. But mostly, I thought about Petty Officer Chen and Petty Officer Rodriguez, about Lieutenant Commander Park, about all the sailors and intelligence operatives whose lives had been destroyed or endangered by Marcus's betrayal. "I approve the sentence as recommended by the court," I said, my voice carrying across the silent courtroom with absolute finality. Marcus was led away in shackles, his expensive suit replaced by standard prisoner transport clothing. As he reached the door of the courtroom, he turned back one final time, his eyes meeting mine across the distance that had always separated us. For a moment, I saw not the arrogant older brother who dominated my childhood, but a broken man finally understanding the true cost of his choices. The courtroom began to empty slowly, but my parents remained in their seats, looking like survivors of some natural disaster who hadn't yet processed the scope of the destruction around them. I approached them for what I knew would be our final conversation as a family. "Sarah," my father began, but his voice failed him. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Sarah, we need to talk about what happens now." I looked at these people who'd shaped my early life and then spent 16 years failing to understand who I'd become. The little girl in me still wanted their approval, still craved the recognition they'd finally been forced to give. But the Admiral in me, the woman who'd earned respect through blood and sacrifice, no longer needed their validation. "There's nothing to talk about, Dad. Marcus made his choices, and now he's paying for them. That's how justice works." My mother reached out toward me, her face streaked with tears. "But he's your brother. He's our son. Surely there's something you can do, some way to help him." The request was so fundamentally misguided that I almost didn't know how to respond. She was asking me to use my position and authority to help the man who'd betrayed everything I'd sworn to protect, who'd gotten my sailors killed, who'd used our family connection as part of his criminal recruitment strategy. "Mom, Marcus sold classified information that got people killed. He used my military service as cover for treason. He's exactly where he belongs." My father's voice carried a note of desperation I'd never heard before. "But you're his sister. Family has to mean something." I looked at him for a long moment, this man who'd spent my entire childhood explaining why I should aim lower and expect less. "Family means loyalty, Dad. It means supporting each other and believing in each other's potential. Marcus betrayed his family the same way he betrayed his country." The conversation continued for several more minutes, but we were speaking different languages. They still saw Marcus as their successful son who'd made a mistake, while I saw him as a traitor who'd exploited every advantage they'd given him to commit crimes against the nation I'd sworn to defend. When I finally walked away from them, I knew it was the last time we would speak as family. The bridge between their world and mine had been burned by Marcus's choices and their inability to understand the magnitude of his betrayal. 6 months later, I stood at the podium of the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, delivering the graduation address to the newest class of senior military leaders. The audience was filled with captains and commanders who would go on to positions of significant responsibility, officers who would shape the future of American naval power and national security. My speech focused on the importance of integrity and leadership, the weight of responsibility that comes with command, and the absolute necessity of putting duty above personal interest. I spoke about the challenges they would face as senior officers, the difficult decisions they would have to make, and the importance of maintaining the trust that the American people place in their military leaders. Command is not a privilege to be enjoyed, I told them, echoing words I'd spoken at dozens of similar ceremonies. It is a burden to be carried with honor and integrity. The moment you begin to see your position as an opportunity for personal gain rather than a responsibility for service, you have begun the process of betraying everything this uniform represents. The words carried special weight for me, shaped by the experience of watching my own brother's betrayal and the family dynamics that had enabled it. I'd learned that respect must be earned through service rather than demanded through blood relation, and that true loyalty means defending principles even when it costs you everything. After the ceremony, I was approached by several of the graduating officers who wanted to discuss career paths and leadership challenges. These conversations were always energizing for me, opportunities to share lessons learned through 16 years of service and to help shape the next generation of naval leaders. One young commander asked about balancing family relationships with military duty, a question that hit closer to home than she could have known. I thought carefully about my answer, wanting to give her guidance that was both honest and helpful. The most important thing to remember, I told her, is that your oath is to the Constitution and the American people, not to any individual person or relationship. Sometimes honoring that oath requires difficult choices, but those choices define who you are as an officer and as a person.
The reception following the ceremony was held in the historic halls of the War College, surrounded by portraits of the naval leaders who'd shaped American maritime strategy over the past century. I moved through the crowd of officers, dignitaries, and family members, comfortable in my role as a senior leader who'd earned her position through merit and dedication. It was during this reception that I received a message that brought my two worlds together one final time. My aide, now Captain Walsh after her own promotion, approached with a secure communication device and an expression that told me the message was significant. "Admiral, we've received confirmation that Lieutenant Commander Park has been successfully recovered," she said quietly. "He's alive and in good condition, considering the circumstances." The news hit me like a wave of relief I hadn't realized I'd been holding back. James Park was alive, finally free from the captivity that had been a direct result of Marcus's betrayal. The missing operative who'd haunted my thoughts for months was coming home to his family. "What's his status?" I asked. "Full recovery expected, ma'am. He'll be debriefed and then given extended leave to readjust. The intelligence he gathered during his captivity has already provided valuable insights into the criminal network that was purchasing classified information." I thought about Park's family, about the months of uncertainty they'd endured, about the moment when they would finally learn that their loved one was safe. It was a reminder that while Marcus's betrayal had caused tremendous damage, the dedication and sacrifice of professionals like Park had ultimately made it possible to recover from that damage and continue the mission. The reception continued around me, but my thoughts were focused on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. I'd spent 16 years building a career in the shadows of my family's indifference, earning respect and authority they'd never bothered to recognize. When the time came to choose between family loyalty and military duty, I'd chosen duty without hesitation. The cost had been significant. I'd lost my family, destroyed relationships that had shaped my early life, and accepted a level of personal isolation that most people would find unbearable. But I'd also upheld the oath I'd sworn as a young officer, protected the sailors and intelligence operatives under my command, and demonstrated that integrity matters more than blood relationships. As the evening wound down, I found myself standing alone on the terrace overlooking Narragansett Bay, watching the lights of pleasure boats moving across the dark water. The scene was peaceful and beautiful, a reminder of the civilian world that military personnel like me were sworn to protect. Captain Walsh joined me on the terrace, carrying 2 cups of coffee and the kind of comfortable silence that comes from years of working together in high-pressure situations. "Any regrets, Admiral?" she asked quietly. I considered her question carefully, thinking about the family relationships I'd lost, the bridges I'd burned, the personal cost of choosing duty over blood loyalty. Then I thought about the sailors who were alive because of the operations I'd protected, the intelligence operatives who'd come home safely because their missions hadn't been compromised, the national security interests that had been preserved because someone had been willing to investigate and prosecute treason regardless of personal connections. No, I said finally, no regrets at all. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Admiral Patricia Voles, the Judge Advocate General who'd authorized Marcus's court-martial. She approached with the bearing of someone who understood the weight of command and the sometimes terrible choices that leadership requires. "Sarah, I wanted to thank you personally for your handling of this case," she said. "I know it couldn't have been easy, but your professionalism throughout the investigation and trial was exemplary." Her words carried the kind of recognition that had always mattered more to me than family approval. This was respect earned through service, acknowledgement from peers who understood the true cost of military leadership, and the importance of maintaining integrity even in the most difficult circumstances. We talked for several minutes about the broader implications of Marcus's case, the lessons learned about operational security, and the ongoing efforts to prevent similar breaches in the future. It was the kind of professional conversation that reminded me why I'd chosen this life, why the uniform I wore represented something more important than personal relationships or family loyalty. As the evening ended and I prepared to return to my quarters, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from the dismissed little sister to the 4-star admiral who delivered justice to a traitor. It had been a long road, marked by sacrifice and isolation, but it had also been a journey toward understanding who I really was and what I was capable of achieving. The little girl who'd been told she'd never make it through basic training had become the woman who'd commanded some of the most sensitive operations in American military history. The young officer who'd been dismissed as a paper pusher had become the admiral who'd investigated and prosecuted one of the most serious intelligence breaches in recent memory. The family that had never understood my service had finally seen me for who I really was, but the recognition had come too late and at too high a cost to rebuild the relationships that had been broken by years of indifference and dismissal. That night, I stood at the window of my quarters looking out at the lights of Newport Harbor and thinking about the parallel lives I'd lived for 16 years, the secret career that had flourished while my family celebrated someone else's success, the professional respect that had grown while personal relationships withered, the sense of purpose and belonging that had developed in the military community while I remained an outsider in my own family. I'd chosen duty over family, integrity over loyalty, and justice over blood relationships. The cost had been enormous, but the alternative, compromising my oath to protect a brother who'd betrayed everything I'd sworn to defend, had been unthinkable. The phone rang softly in my quarters, and I saw a number I didn't recognize on the display. For a moment, I wondered if it might be my parents, trying one more time to bridge the gap that Marcus's betrayal had opened. But when I answered, the voice on the other end was unfamiliar. "Admiral Mitchell, this is Carol Park, James Park's wife. I wanted to thank you personally for bringing my husband home." Her words carried a weight of gratitude that reminded me why I'd made the choices I'd made. While my own heirlooms had been destroyed by Marcus's betrayal, other families had been saved by the investigation that brought him to justice. "Mrs. Park, your husband's service and sacrifice exemplified the best of what this uniform represents. Bringing him home was an honor." We talked for several more minutes about her husband's recovery, about the support available for returning intelligence operatives, about the gratitude of a nation that often doesn't fully understand the sacrifices made by military families. When the call ended, I felt a sense of completion that had been missing since Marcus's sentencing. The next morning brought new challenges and responsibilities, ongoing operations that required my attention, and decisions that would affect the safety of personnel around the world. The work continued, as it always did, driven by the needs of national security and the oath I'd sworn to protect and defend the Constitution. But as I prepared for another day of command responsibilities, I carried with me the knowledge that I'd faced the ultimate test of that oath and chosen duty over personal interest. The little sister who'd been dismissed and underestimated had become the admiral who delivered justice to a traitor, proving that respect must be earned rather than demanded, and that true loyalty means defending principles even when it costs you everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.